Lastly, let's look at sci-fi as prophetic, and this is looking at the genre of science fiction. Science fiction authors imagine unimaginable futuristic technology and events because it has to be out of the realm of current science. That's why it's science fiction, is because it's a little far-fetched to be completely believable, but believable enough that it's still part of a good story. And those things that they predict often come to be. It's just that we're not at a point technologically to actually do that yet. Okay? A good example is Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park science fiction. It's written in the 1980s, and it talks about genetic manipulation and basically pulling genes together to create creatures, right? Now, that was breaking science at the time as genetics and DNA of 1980s. Okay, jump ahead 30 years later, and we can do genetic stuff very easily. Okay, anybody can go and get a genetic test. Okay, we've cloned things and have done all sorts of genetic manipulation up to this point, which was only imaginable at the point that Jurassic Park was written. Now, it's perceivable, it's totally within the realm of our technology that if we had dinosaur DNA, we could potentially make one today. That question remains: can we get dinosaur DNA? You can go into that and research that possibility if you want, but it's a good example. 1980s Jurassic Park, science fiction, which today seems more within the realm of possibility than it did back then. He was a prophet of where our tech would come up to this point. Now let's look at the War of the Worlds. It was written in 1898. What was happening in 1898 in terms of war or technology? Well, in 1898, wars were fought on the ground with soldiers and guns. Okay. The story depicts the horrors of a war fought with giant fighting machines, though, which is different. So even the perception of a futuristic war, what does that look like? Giant fighting machines, flying machines, and even the use of chemical weapons, or a weapon of some sort of mass destruction like the heat ray. Okay, what do we have nowadays? Well, wars are very different nowadays. They are fought with giant fighting machines and tanks and pilotless drones and aircraft and boats and whatever, and chemical weaponry, okay, chemical warfare, or even biological warfare nowadays. Okay, so interesting. The depiction of war and the technologies that would be present in futuristic war were something that were written about in the War of the Worlds. As the Martians come with all their high-tech war equipment, humans would have those by World War One, tanks and planes and chemical weaponry. Okay, starting with World War One, modern warfare, these horrors became a reality with the use of tanks, airplanes, chemical weapons, biological weapons with disastrous effects. By World War Two, we would have nuclear weaponry, something even worse than the heat ray. Okay, by the way, 1938, you might think, what could we use to take out a Martian machine? Well, you could use a nuke, but they weren't invented in 1938. Okay, when the War of the Worlds was written, another thing is that space travel was only a dream. Mars was a mystery. We didn't know anything about it, but since then, Mars is the most well-known planet in our solar system other than the Earth. We've sent many human spacecraft that have landed or orbited Mars multiple times and have plans well into the future of different missions. And even human missions are within the realm of possibility today. And I believe within our lifetime, we'll land people on Mars and have them return and potentially set up colonies on the moon and Mars. So these are things that are within the realm of possibility now that 100 years ago were never, ever imaginable in terms of happening. So science fiction as prophetic. And that's what I like about science fiction authors, is that they have to think about an unimaginable future that pushes the boundaries of what we envision and what we dream for what we can do as humans. And that's hard to do because it's so hard for the rest of us to think outside the bounds of reality and imagine something amazing. So again, another plug to appreciate authorship and sci-fi authorship, especially their prophetic ability to depict technologies or situations that are yet to be seen, but possible. Okay. Now there are countless other examples of science fiction authors and tech that we see and developments in humanity that we see to this day. I'm not going to get into them all, but it does give you an idea into the look of science fiction and science fiction authorship and prophecy. Who knows? Maybe you guys will be good sci-fi authors someday, and we'll get into the genre a little bit and see how of an awesome genre it actually is. I would recommend anything by H.G. Wells, even Jules Verne, if you want to look at some older science fiction authors, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. So let's conclude here with the question: does Orson Welles and H.G. Wells ever meet to discuss their versions of the original story? H.G. Wells, you might think, had died at this point. In fact, he had not. He was alive and he didn't tune in live to Orson Welles' version, but I think, by the way, we haven't looked at this, they have the same last name minus the spelling, which is coincidental. They're not related, and H.G. Wells is a British author. But in time, British and other radio companies would take up versions of Orson Welles' play and project them on screen or on radio. So H.G. Wells eventually does come to know that Orson Welles had kind of done a spoof off of his story, War of the Worlds. So go ahead and listen to this. It's a kind of a neat little audio. In fact, if I click that, we can listen to it together. And that's going to be our wrap up to the story. All right? So I want to say thanks for journeying along with this tale. And I hope you pulled something out of it. I know normally I would have done a project and other interactive things with you, but I hope this was good enough to get your brain juices flowing a little bit about literature, about a really cool story that I think has a lot of relevance to what we're going through right now. Don't ever hesitate to go ahead and read cool things, to judge stories, whether they're good or not, to look at titles, authorship, and to try to uncover points and themes that a story might be challenging us to think about, and just in general to wonder about the world around you. So I will call it off here. We can go ahead and listen to this. But until next time, don't be lame, and we'll see you at next unit's stuff. Take care.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Charles C. Shaw speaking. KTSA is honored this evening by the presence in our studios of two great men, the Honorable H.G. Wells, world-famous British historian, author, and student of world affairs, and Mr. Orson Welles, the genius of stage, screen, and radio. This is the first time that Mr. H.G. Wells and Mr. Orson Welles have appeared together. In fact, they met for the first time only yesterday here in San Antonio. But this is not the first time that their names have been linked. 2 years ago, Mr. Orson Welles adapted Mr. H.G. Wells' book, War of the Worlds, for radio purposes, and you know the rest. Revising the story somewhat, Mr. Orson Welles depicted an invasion of the United States by men from Mars. Although he explained it numerous times during the program that it was fictitious, the country at large was frightened almost out of its wits. Men called radio stations offering to enlist against the Martians. Others were panic-stricken. The realism of the production, frightening though it was a tribute to Mr. Orson Welles' genius. And thus the name of Wells, H-G-W-E-L-L-S, and Orson, W-E-L-L-E-S, became linked. Mr. H.G. Wells, in the opinion of many, is the world's most famous man of letters. He has come to San Antonio to address the United States Brewers Association, and Mr. Orson Welles is here for a town hall forum address Wednesday. In this meeting of great minds, I feel rather inconspicuous, and the less I have to say, the better you listeners will like it. But first, could I interest you gentlemen in a discussion of Mr. Orson Welles' broadcast of Mr. H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds.
You're turning the meeting over to us, sir?
I am, for the moment.
He's turning it over to us. Well, I've had a series of the most delightful experiences since I came to America. But the best thing that has happened so far is meeting my little namesake here, Orson. I find him the most delightful carrier. He carries my name and an extra E that I hope he'll drop sooner or later. See no sense in it. And I've known his work before he made this sensational Halloween spree. Are you sure there was such a panic in America, or wasn't it your Halloween fun?
I think that's the nicest thing that a man from England could possibly say about the men from Mars. Because Mr. Hitler made a good deal of sport of it, you know. Actually spoke of it in the great Munich speech, you know. And there were floats in Nazi
he
parades
hadn't much
showing...
else to say.
That's right. There isn't much else to say. And it's supposed to show the corrupt condition and decadent state of affairs in democracies that the War of the Worlds went over as well as it did. I think it's very nice of Mr. Wells to say that not only I didn't mean it, but the American people didn't mean it.
That was our impression in England. We had articles about it, and people said, "Have you never heard of Halloween in America when everybody pretends to see ghosts?" Yes.
Well, there was some excitement caused. I really can't belittle the amount that was caused, but I think that the people got over it very quickly, don't you?
What kind of excitement? Mr. H.G. Wells wants to know if the excitement wasn't the same kind of excitement that we extract from a practical joke in which somebody puts a sheet over his head and says, "Boo." I don't think anybody believes that that individual is a ghost, but we do scream and yell and rush down the hall. And that's just about what happened.
That's a very excellent description.
You aren't quite serious in America yet. You haven't got the war right under your chins, and the consequences you can still play with ideas of terror and conflict.
You think that's good or bad?
It's a natural thing to do until you're right up against it.
So it ceases to be a game.
And then it ceases to be a game.
Well, now, here's a thought. Some of Mr. H.G. Wells' writings are termed fantastic, and a few years ago, well might they have been conceived such. The Shape of Things to Come, which told of a long internecine war, was such a fantasy. But, Mr. Orson Welles, do you think that it's so fantastic in view of today's events?
It certainly is not so fantastic. And the one question that Mr. Wells has spoken of, not only in The Shape of Things to Come, but has hinted at or directly prophesied such a state of affairs following a wasting war and a return to a feudalism from which the world would find itself again. And today in Mr. Wells's lecture, he said quite the most interesting thing that I've heard in a long time. He said that he'd commenced just recently to ask himself if there was any reason why mankind should so emulate the phoenix and should so get itself out of its mess. He proposed a couple of solutions, but he did admit that there was a possible excuse for a gloomy point of view, and that it would be good to be realistic about it and not to dismiss the gloomy point of view anymore. Perhaps the time had come to look ahead, since the future, Mr. Wells's future, which we've always adored and never really understood, is suddenly upon us.
Mm-hmm.
And we are living right now in that famous H.G. Wells future, which we all knew about.
Now, before we get away from this microphone, tell me about this film of yours that you've been producing. You're a producer, aren't you? You're
That's right.
art director, you're everything.
Well, Mr. Wells,
What's the film called?
it's called Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane, yes.
Citizen-
Not C-A-I-N.
No, K-A-N-E, and this is, of course, the kindest
Ah,
and
yes.
most gracious possible thing to do. Mr. Wells is making it possible for me to do what in America is spoken of as a plug. And he understands
Do they
this fine
call
old
it-
American
I don't
culture.
understand these words. Yes. Yes.
You understand the value, however. Mr. Wells wants me to tell you that I have made a motion picture, and he is kind enough to ask me a leading question concerning it.
I'm looking forward to it.
You're very kind, sir. It's a new sort of motion picture with a new method of presentation and a few new technical experiments, a few new methods of telling a picture, not only from the point of view of writing, but of showing it.
If I don't misunderstand you completely, I think there'll be a lot of jolly good new noises in it. What do you think?
I hope so. I think a few jolly good new noises are what the motion pictures could well afford these days. I hope you're right, and I hope there are some jolly good new noises. I can think of nothing more desirable in motion picture. I'm all for some jolly good new noises.